of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development, conformément à la...
Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Thursday, October 29th, 2020, the committee commenced its study of arms export permits with a particular focus on permits granted for exports to Turkey.
To ensure an orderly meeting, I encourage all participants to mute their microphones when they're not speaking and to address comments through the chair. When you have 30 seconds remaining in your questioning or speaking time, I will signal you with this now customary piece of yellow paper. Interpretation services are available through the globe icon at the bottom of your screen. And colleagues, our witnesses have agreed to make themselves available until 5:45. That gives us a full hour with them. I propose that we continue on that basis. And maintenant, j'aimerais souhaiter la bienvenue.
And now I would like to welcome our witnesses.
International Canada, Justin Mohammed, Human Rights Law and Policy Campaigner, as well as Stacia Luft, Articling Fellow. From Project Plowshares, we have César Jaramillo, Directeur Exécutif, and Kelsey Gallagher, Rechercheur. And the Rideau Institute on International Affairs, we have with us Peggy Mason, President. And without further ado, we will start with Amnesty International for 5 minutes of opening remarks. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm joining the committee from unceded Algonquin territory in Ottawa, Ontario. And of course, would like to thank the committee for inviting us, particularly on International Human Rights Day, and wish all of the committee members a happy International Human Rights Day. Mr. Chair, committee members, as you may know, Canada acceded to the Arms Trade Treaty, or as we will refer to it, the ATT, in September last year, after which it became binding on Canada at international law. It is an important convention that can help prevent the commission of serious international crimes, including genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. This is why Amnesty International has campaigned in Canada and around the world to encourage states to adopt domestic laws that fully implement its terms. Amnesty International is encouraged by this committee's decision to study controls, protocols, and policies around the granting and freezing of arms exports. However, we would respectfully remind the committee that these measures are, quite simply, not law. The starting point must be to ensure that Canada's legal framework fully implements all of its international legal obligations under the treaty. Bill C-47, which amended the Export-Import Permit Act, or as I will refer to it, the EIPA, was introduced to implement the ATT, and it did strengthen Canada's export control regime. However, the legal and regulatory regime that it created failed to fully implement the treaty. Several civil society organizations provided written briefs about these deficiencies to the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee in November 2018, and again when Global Affairs Canada undertook consultations to develop a regulations package to accompany Bill C-47 in April 2019. Allow me to provide just two examples that were highlighted in those briefs. First, Article 6 of the ATT contains an absolute prohibition on certain weapons transfers, such as those that violate UN Security Council arms embargoes, or transfers where there is knowledge that the arms would be used to commit genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. The absolute prohibition on such exports does not exist in Canadian law. Second, there are also deficiencies around the US weapons export process. Through the use of a so-called general export permit, almost all US weapons exports are exempted from the review mandated by Article 6 and Article 7 of the ATT. Such exemptions are not permissible under the treaty. The consequences of failing to fully incorporate the ATT in Canadian law, as my colleagues will elaborate, is that Canada continues to export weapons where there are significant concerns about the possibility of their use in the commission of serious international crimes. And I'll now turn it over to my colleague Stacia Luft to continue our testimony.
Thank you. Our understanding of Canada's export review process, post-Bill C-47, is informed by Global Affairs Canada's final report on weapons exports to Saudi Arabia. The Minister of Foreign Affairs ordered officials to release the document earlier this year. While this exercise in transparency is to be commended, the final report displays serious gaps in Canada's export evaluation process. First, the final report improperly suggests that the definition of substantial risk should consider whether a pattern of repetitive behavior can be identified with respect to human rights violations. This is not the correct metric under the ATT. The prospect of risk is, and what needs to be considered. While the pattern of repetitive behavior could be an indicator of risk, It is not determinative of risk. It indicates a higher threshold than the treaty requires. Second, the final report did not rely on reports authored by human rights or civil society organizations, which have long documented Saudi human rights violations and possible violations of international humanitarian law. It was also selective in its treatment of the UN Group of Eminent Experts report from 2019. Finally, the report made errors in interpreting international humanitarian law. For example, the report is dismissive of concerns about sniper rifles, saying that they are intended to support precision targeting and thus less likely to result in civilian casualties. While a sniper rifle is a permissible means of warfare, this does not mean that the methods of their use have been compliant. A sniper rifle in the hands of someone using it to target civilians is no less an international humanitarian law violation. If this is the rigor that is applied to questions of international humanitarian law when Canada conducts arms exports, it is undoubtedly lacking. So why does Canada need a more rigorous export control system, specifically one that fully implements the ATT? The Saudi case is illustrative. Saudi Arabia's human rights record is beyond debate. It is an established violator of human rights both domestically and internationally. These acts all raise questions if such a record does not constitute a risk of Canadian weapons being used to commit serious international human rights and international humanitarian law violations, then what does? In conclusion, Amnesty International offers two recommendations for the committee's consideration, and I will be brief. First, Canada should amend its domestic legislation to ensure that it is fully compliant with all of the terms of the ATT. In the interim, the Governor and Council could enact regulations that would give those obligations the force of law. Second and finally, Canada should reassess export permits where violations of international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and gender-based violence have been alleged by domestic and international investigative bodies or by human rights and civil society organizations. Now, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mohammed, Ms. Luft. We will now turn the floor over to Project Plowshares, also for 5 minutes of introductory remarks, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to present before this distinguished committee. Distinguished members of the committee, contrary to government claims, Canada does not have one of the strongest export control systems in the world. This is not a matter of opinion or interpretation. The annual reports on Canadian military exports prepared by Global Affairs Canada confirm an unassailable fact. Today, most Canadian arms exports help to sustain autocratic regimes, to perpetuate armed conflict, or to enable the violation of human rights. A recent example concerns Canadian military exports to Turkey. Optical sensors produced in Ontario by L3 Harris Westcam have been found in numerous other conflict zones, including Syria, Iraq, and Libya. Most recently, they were used by Azerbaijan in attacks against Armenian targets in Nagorno-Karabakh. These exports pose a substantial risk of violations of human rights and international humanitarian law. In the case of Libya, they constitute a blatant breach of an arms embargo imposed by the United Nations Security Council. Canada's suspension of arms exports to Turkey following reports of misuse was welcome and necessary. But if recent history is any indication, it could be short-lived. This was the fourth time in just over 3 years that Canada has announced the suspension of export permits to a country accused of violating international law. Two of the incidents involved Saudi Arabia, the top destination for Canadian arms exports, and one of the worst violators of human rights on the planet. Each time, the suspension was eventually lifted when the media scrutiny had died down. In the case of the Saudi exports, the suspensions did not stop a single export because they only applied to future permits. The troubling reality is that the Canadian arms industry has become alarmingly linked with disreputable regimes that are engaged in some of the world's most devastating conflicts. We are aware that this view clashes with the carefully crafted government discourse on the high standards of rigor and transparency that purportedly inform Canada's arms exports decision. But the evidence is sturdy and compelling.
Thank you,
And
Cesar.
the world is taking notice, and the world is taking notice. In September of this year, a group of eminent international and regional experts on Yemen, mandated by the United Nations Human Rights Council, issued a report that confirmed not only the pattern of human rights abuses by all parties to the conflict, but also the role that Canada and other arms exporters to the warring parties have played to perpetuate the crisis. There is a clear gap between rhetoric and practice around Canadian arms exports, and it is high time for strict parliamentary oversight of this important aspect of Canadian foreign policy. A place to start might be the establishment of a subcommittee of this Standing Committee of Foreign Affairs and International Development to ensure compliance with domestic and international law, including Canada's obligations under the Arms Trade Treaty. Now I'll give the floor to my colleague, Kelsey Gallagher.
Thank you, Cesar. And thank you for having us today. Members of the committee, in recent years, Canada has exported large volumes of Canadian-made L3 Harris Westcam surveillance and target acquisition sensors to Turkey for use by the Turkish military. These sensors are primarily attached to the underside of aircraft, including drones, and are used to surveil potential targets on the ground. However, they should not be mistaken for mere cameras. The variant of Canadian-made sensors exported to Turkey, the Westcam MX-15D, is also fitted with a laser designator. This component directs munitions towards their targets and is vital to launch modern airstrikes. The majority of Canadian-made sensors exported to Turkey are used on the Turkish Bayraktar TB2 drone and have seen extensive use in combat across several conflict zones. Turkey has also provided them to allied actors in Libya and Nagorno-Karabakh. Turkey's provision of Westcam sensors to its allies is a textbook example of diversion, which is the illicit transfer of weapons systems to unauthorized users. The case of Canadian weapons being diverted to the conflict in Libya is particularly troublesome, as this also constitutes a breach of the almost decade-old UN arms embargo against that country. Diversion is prohibited under the Arms Trade Treaty, to which Canada is a party. As such, the Government of Canada is obligated under international law to stem the illicit diversion of weapon systems, which would indisputably apply to the case of Turkey. Whereas Canada's temporary suspension of arms exports to Turkey is a step in the right direction, the move is long overdue. According to a UN report published last year, since at least May 2019, Turkey has been diverting drones to Libya, including the Bayraktar TB2 that is invariably equipped with Canadian-made Westcam sensors. These findings alone should have made clear the substantial risk associated with these arms exports. Given Turkey's brazen behavior in Libya, it should have come as no surprise to Global Affairs Canada that the same Canadian weapons would also be found illicitly fueling the war in Nagorno-Karabakh. By all accounts, Turkey's provision of weapons to Azerbaijan substantially influenced the outcome of that conflict. To satisfy its obligations under international law, the Government of Canada should move to fully cease the further export of such weapon systems to Turkey, or run the risk of non-compliance with the international arms control frameworks it has voluntarily acceded to. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And our final set of opening remarks goes to the Rideau Institute on International Affairs. Ms. Mason, the floor is yours for 5 minutes, please. Ms. Mason, you may be on mute. If you can just double check your mic.
Sorry. My apologies. Thank you very much for inviting me here today. Merci pour cette invitation.
Thank you for the invitation.
Impartial Canadian Arms Export Control Agency. Since I became president of the Rideau Institute in June 2014, we have been tracking the long and sordid saga of our continuing arms exports to Saudi Arabia no matter what. These exports have continued despite heinous internal repression in the Saudi kingdom, state-planned assassinations potentially reaching onto Canadian territory, and the ultimate black eye, a UN human rights expert report explicitly naming and shaming arms exporters, including, and I quote, Canada, Iran, and the UK, for, quote, perpetuating the conflict in Yemen, unquote, and the almost incalculable human suffering it has engendered there. But alas, there is much more. As you have heard, Project Plowshares has exhaustively documented evidence of Canadian drone technology exported to Turkey being used in conflicts in Libya, Syria, and Iraq. the allegations of Turkey transferring this equipment to armed groups in Libya, contrary to a decade-long UN Security Council imposed mandatory arms embargo, are particularly shocking. And then there is Nagorno-Karabakh. We have seen a cynical pattern of global affairs suspending new export permits under the glare of media scrutiny, announcing an internal investigation, and then lifting the suspension when the media hype dies down, all the while, in most cases, continuing the actual exports anyway under existing permits. The Global Affairs report justifying the lifting of the latest Saudi arms permit suspension even argued that, despite repeated calls by UN experts for all countries to cease their arms exports, Canadian arms were somehow not implicated. This, in turn, led to the UN expert group in their next report, the September 2021, to explicitly name Canada. Never, as a former ambassador, did I ever imagine seeing the name of Canada in such a report. So I asked the question, what is the point of global affairs investigating itself? There is an obvious conflict of interest because Global Affairs Canada is pursuing two contradictory policy objectives: enabling sales of weapons to foreign buyers on the one hand, and adhering to international and national obligations designed to protect human rights and international security that require strict limits on those sales on the other. In addition, when the minister announces an investigation by Global Affairs, he or she is really asking officials to determine whether they gave him or her bad advice the first time round. How likely are they to do that? The new regulatory framework in place that allowed Canada to accede to the Arms Trade Treaty puts hard legal limits on the discretion of the minister to approve exports. But the problem is not these provisions as written. The problem is the law as applied, or more accurately, as not applied. How can the government of Canada be compelled to act in accordance with Canadian law? Currently, the only recourse citizens have aside from the Court of Public Opinion is to take the government of Canada to the federal court. But such proceedings are lengthy and expensive and necessarily after the fact. That is why we need a new independent agency to impartially administer our arms exports in full accordance with Canadian and international law. The arguments in favor include no conflict of interest on the part of the administrators between trade promotion and respecting human rights, UN arms embargoes, and other Canadian legal obligations. Officials not being asked to review their own past recommendations. Independent expert legal advice based on all available evidence together with other requisite expertise guiding the decisions. And a House of Commons committee could be mandated to provide parliamentary oversight as recommended by Project Plowshares here today. And the ultimate benefit for elected officials is taking the domestic politics out of the equation. In the meantime, there are two immediate steps that Global Affairs can take to improve its current dismal record. One, begin consultations on the creation of an arm's length advisory panel as promised in April 2020. And two, mandate an independent expert legal opinion on compliance with Canada's international legal obligations as an integral part of the current Global Affairs export permit application process. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Mason. We will now go into our first round of questions, and these are 6-minute series, and the first of them goes to Mr. Chung. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Spengeman. I'd like to talk about the authorities under the Export and Import Permits Act. My understanding, and like Ms. Mason and the witnesses from Project Plowshares to comment on this, my understanding is that a number of years ago, these authorities were delegated into Global Affairs and below the ministerial level, and that several years ago, those delegated authorities were revoked, and it was put back into the minister's office. Do you have any information on that, Ms. Mason or Mr. Jaramillo? or Mr. Gallagher?
If I might respond, well, I was involved in the last update to the export control guidelines in 1986, when under the Mulroney government, and at that time, the export permits, unless they were very uncontroversial, had to go to the minister's office.
Okay.
So, as far as I'm aware, it is quite some time that there is a requirement, for the minister to approve the permits.
Anybody from Project Plowshares on this?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chung. That's an excellent question. The minister used to have almost full authority to authorize any and all exports to any destination, regardless of the human rights record of the recipient. Recently, as part of Bill C-47, which is the legislation that was getting Canada ready to accede to the Arms Trade Treaty, that changed in a positive way. There is something now called the substantial risk clause, whereby if the minister in the risk assessment, Global Affairs Canada, determines that there is a risk of misuse of a certain export, now the minister not only has the option, but indeed the obligation to deny such export. So we're in a much stronger position now. But as my colleague Peggy Mason from the Rideau Institute said, that is the law. But there remains a gap between the law as written and the law as implemented. And it is the implementation of the law where we see severe shortcomings.
So to be clear, your understanding is that the authorities are no longer delegated, that they are with the minister.
That is correct. That is our understanding.
Another quick question to follow up on. Do we know what happened with the risk assessment conducted by Global Affairs officials in respect of these arms exports to Turkey? Do we know what the conclusion of that risk assessment was? Whether it was to recommend the permits be approved or to recommend that they be denied?
If I can respond first, so far as we are aware, it's still ongoing. We actually haven't heard anything about the investigation. The last we heard of the investigation was the Globe and Mail report on October 30th.
Yeah, I'm not referring to the investigation. I'm referring to the original risk assessment that would have been conducted by officials before the minister signed off on the permit.
Again, an excellent question about which we know nothing, because that really is the...
We don't either. That's why I'm asking.
Yeah. And but there's another aspect to this, and that is the fact that it was against the backdrop of a full embargo by Canada.
Yeah, I understand that.
Somehow,
so my second quick question is, why did the government on April 16th, I believe it was, change its suspension of all arms exports to Turkey?
Officials will have to answer that question, because no public information has been given, and
we haven't got it either. That's why I'm asking the question. I have another question. In Project Plowshares report, I noted that Canadian military exports to Turkey rose from $4 million in 2016 to $152 million last year. I know you don't know exactly the makeup of that, but is it safe to assume that the vast majority of that is these optical systems from Westcam Industries?
Yes, that is our understanding. And we can judge that by looking at the annual report on military exports, which is tabled annually on May 31st. The majority of exports to Turkey are under ECL category, Group 2, Category 215. Which relates to optics, imagery, that sort of thing.
Another quick question on this. I would like your expert opinion on how much of a game changer these drone systems were in the recent conflict in the Caucasus. Were they a minor player in what happened, or were they a significant change in the balance of power in the region?
So they were widely reported to be, at least the drones they were used on, right? Because that's the majority of the reporting was on the drone, the Bayraktar TB2. The TB2s provided via Turkey to Azerbaijan were widely reported to be a game changer, right? This allowed Azeri forces to strike farther than they could very quickly, and Armenian forces, to my reading, didn't really have much of a chance to defend against it. So from the outset, this was a shift in the conflict.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Mason, do you have a comment on our view expert opinion on these drones in the recent conflict?
I don't have any. I would just echo what has been said by Project Plowshare's representatives.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chung. The next round goes to Dr. Fry again for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. I must say that each of your reports are very detailed, and they speak about legal obligations, especially when you look at Turkey, which continues to divert arms sales, and they're prohibited from doing this. Now, I am not trying to say that Canada has nothing to do with it, but the NATO countries that continue to allow Turkey to violate the ATT, what is the role of those countries in looking at Turkey's violation? Do you believe, and somebody who knows the innards of this thing, like Ms. Mason, can tell us, is it that Canada is not able to do anything because the other NATO members, because you mentioned the UK and the USA, are putting pressure on them to keep the status quo and the violations okay because of various geopolitical reasons? Can somebody answer me that? I mean, it's a loaded question, but I don't know the answer because none of us know what's going on here. But can you tell me something, Ms. Mason, about how that would work internally to NATO, and then Mr. Jaramillo can respond?
Yes, thank you very much. Well, first of all, I don't know of any. I don't know of any such pressure. But the far more important point is that it's entirely beside the point. Canada has legal obligations which it has freely entered into with respect to the Arms Trade Treaty. It also has obligations which have been posed by the UN Security Council when we're talking about arms embargoes. And Canada has to, it is the responsibility of the Canadian government to adhere to Canadian and to fully implement Canadian law. So one, I haven't seen any. I mean, as a practical point, NATO countries are all over the map with respect, to Turkey. But the main point is that each country has the sovereign obligation to fully implement its obligations under its national law and international law. And there's no way you can excuse, say, oh, somebody pressured me, to not follow my, Canadian law.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Fry. That's an excellent question. We often hear from NATO members, not just in this instance, but in general, the need to maintain military interoperability, and that is often given as a blanket reason for these dubious transactions. But as Ms. Mason said, that is no excuse whatsoever for failing to uphold the law. The Arms Trade Treaty or domestic Canadian law make no exemptions for military interoperability or for any other reasons. Canada is obligated to uphold the law, and other countries that may also be encouraging behavior. The poor behavior of other states does not excuse Canadian poor behavior. Put another way.
Thank you. Now you talked about the need to amend domestic law with regard to the ATT. What are those amendments you think we should be doing? I thought the law was specific already in keeping with the ATT, but should it be amended even further, our domestic law? And how do we keep domestic politics out of it? Because again, one knows what happens at question period when somebody gets up and asks a question, and everything becomes a political minefield and muddy the waters, as opposed to looking clearly at our legislation and at our obligations. So when you look at Bill C-49, how do we amend that? Should it be amended? What are the next steps we should do, to ensure, you talked about an arm's length watchdog group that is going to be clear in terms of its legal obligations, its legal arm's length, etc., and that is something that could happen. How do you escape that political minefield that occurs in the House of Commons when you take this to the House, you look at voting, and then everyone plays games with it. What can one do? I am asking this question not because I'm being partisan at all, but because I do not want Canada to have its name muddied internationally with us not living up to obligations. What is a domestic legislation should look like?
Thank you. I wonder, you did ask about, the first part of your question was with respect to comments that have been made, and they were made by Amnesty, by Justin Mohammed and Amnesty International, specifically about the fact that Bill C-47, to allow Canada to accede to the Arms Trade Treaty, actually did not implement all of the obligations of the Arms Trade Treaty. So I think perhaps, I mean, I would like to turn it to him to answer that part. And then with respect to the arms length agency, I mean, I'm making a radical proposal here in traditional terms. It's not actually radical when you consider the kind of world we live in now and the kind of challenges and the kind of new think we need. It's not actually that radical at all. It's just radical for, you know, the old time diplomacy at Global Affairs. But if it's an independent agency that has the final decision making, then parliamentarians wouldn't be implicated in it. The report would go to Parliament, and they could debate the report, and they could debate whether or not there should be new legislation and so on. But the individual decisions would be made by the independent agency. And an example reaching way back would be with respect, if you recall, the way back in the 80s, the tainted tuna scandal. And that led to the minister losing any right to overrule the findings of inspectors. And ultimately, that led to taking things like food safety out of Agricultural Canada, which was promoting food, and putting it into a separate, discrete agency, the Canada Food Protection Agency, which has that mandate. And so, that was done in 1997. So it's not that we can't do these kinds of things. It's just that with diplomacy, sometimes in those areas, these things are made to seem more difficult.
Ms. Mason, I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Fry. And Monsieur Bergeron, vous avez la parole pour 6 minutes maintenant.
Monsieur le Président, sur cette...
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And on the same line of questioning, because we saw the Minister of Foreign Affairs has significant powers, even though there are clear parameters. And we saw that the minister is indeed seeking to repeat the current expression, to not have a monkey on his back. So we saw with this suspension of the moratorium on arms sales to Saudi Arabia, where in the middle of the pandemic, the minister took this decision, which surprised, I think, more or less everyone. I had the opportunity to speak to the minister, or to communicate with him, and I said, look, there's a report that was sent to me that was relatively independent, telling me that we could move forward. So I asked to see that report, and to my great surprise, it's an internal report from Foreign Affairs, and it was totally designed to legitimize the lifting of this moratorium. You can read in this report the sort of kinds of arguments saying that we're seeing that there are breaches of human rights or violations of human rights, but to a certain degree, they weren't sufficiently documented. So this is an argument that we've heard quite a bit over the last few weeks from Global Affairs Canada. And the minister added that he was surrounded by a sort of committee of wise people to help him under the circumstances. So personally, I didn't see any trace of such a committee. And did I miss some episode here? And I'm speaking to all of the witnesses here. Were you informed of this so-called committee of wise men and women who advises the minister as to the decisions that he's supposed to take regarding the sales of Canadian arms?
Thank you for the question. If I may address it briefly. Yes, can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Thank you for that question. We were taken aback by the lifting of the moratorium to Saudi Arabia, even if it was some along the pattern of no matter what in terms of arms sales to Saudi Arabia. Like you said, it was a decision taken in the middle of a pandemic. It was taken nearly 2 years after the brutal assassination of Jamal Khashoggi by Saudi authorities in Istanbul, at the consulate in Istanbul. It was taken shortly before Canada joined a United Nations Security Council appeal for a ceasefire, and shortly before Canada lost its bid for a seat at the United Nations Security Council. So taken together, really, I mean, there is something to be said about the rationale for this decision, for this ill-advised decision, when the risk of exports to Saudi Arabia are clear and present. So I would echo the words of Ms. Mason earlier when she said that these arms exports seem to be a deal no matter what, whereby every red flag, every possible red flag has been raised, and the government consistently continues determined to honor this ill-fated deal.
I wonder if I could jump in on a couple of things. Reference was made to wise men. That's an announcement that the minister made, that he was going to establish a group of experts, independent experts that would advise, but that hasn't been done yet. A reference has also been made to what kind of an investigation actually goes on, and I think we should look at the Turkish example, where within weeks, the Globe and Mail got an independent reporter on the ground to go and take pictures in Armenia of the equipment in question, demonstrating clearly that it was Canadian Westcam technology. And when Global Affairs was asked if they had sent anybody, they hadn't. And then they were asked if they were going to send anybody to check it out, and they wouldn't commit to it. So the reports say they don't have any evidence. There hasn't been any evidence on the ground that they could find. But so far as we can tell, they don't even make an effort to find that evidence, and they certainly don't accept the documented evidence presented by international organizations. Like Amnesty International and Oxfam and so on.
If I might just add one further comment on the question of the final report that is being raised. I think it's important to recognize, number one, that as a matter of Canadian law, the discretion around this, the analysis that's to be conducted, if you look at Section 7 of the Import-Export Permit Act, does leave that with the minister. So the idea of having some kind of committee advise the minister may be academically interesting, but we have no details about what the minister intends to do with that information and how exactly it will intersect with his obligation under the terms of the EIPA, the Canadian legislation. And the second thing to mention about the final report is that this is our first insight into the substantial risk test, which is something that my colleague had mentioned. And I would encourage committee members to have a look at the annex to that report, because it does talk about how Canada is to interpret. It gives us a first indication as to how officials are interpreting the question of substantial risk. If you look to the annex of that report, you'll notice that there are entire sections that are blacked out, that we don't have any more understanding about how exactly the government intends to use this criteria. And as my colleague has already pointed out, the final report itself has many troubling references to the notion of repeated use. Well, that is not the risk analysis that is envisioned by the ATT, or for that matter, by the EIPA in Canadian law.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Bergeron.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bergeron.
Again, for 6 minutes, please.
I didn't hear you, Chair, but I assumed you were referring to me as having 6
Indeed.
minutes available.
Yes,
thank you
do.
very much.
Absolutely.
Thank you to our witnesses for your evidence on this very crucial topic. We have, of course, the obligations under the ATT and the obligations under the legislation. And as has been pointed out, there are some differences. The first thing I'd like to ask, though, before I get to that, is we're talking here in the case of Turkey about drones and drone technology, and we know that that we don't need to see, by your analysis, patterns of violations to establish a substantial risk, but just the substantial risk itself. Is the drone technology per se involve a substantial risk of violations of international human rights obligations or obligations under the treaty? And I invite you all to have a quick yes or no, I guess, on that, because I think in some cases it's regarded as being a violation. Surely the case of Libya, where it's an embargo situation, yes, of course. But does that have to be assessed on a country by country basis, or does it have to be have serious end user requirements or knowledge before it can be assessed? Perhaps starting with Amnesty International.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Harris. But my colleagues, I think from Plowshares and potentially Rideau Institute will have more to say. The one thing that I would just mention that's important in that connection, I think particularly in the Turkish context, is Article 7.7 of the ATT, which talks about the notion that even after an export has been granted, the notion that the state party should then continually renew more information as it comes out. And I think that's one of the useful pieces that would come in the Turkish context.
That's a subsequent question that I want to get into, and that's part of the requirements of the AT&T, but is not in part of Canadian law. So I think that's something important. But Project Plowshares, would your representatives tell us whether you think that the drone technology itself is well, it's obviously subject to significant human rights violations, but would you consider it itself to be a weapon that's particularly exposes substantial risk?
Yes, with the caveat that that exports need to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. So the technology alone paints part of the picture, but you need to look at the nature of the recipient and any related precedents that would paint the full picture around risk.
Thank you.
Yes, and just to add to that, I would agree. I mean, this is a case-by-case basis, but it is exported as a weapon, and it certainly is a weapon. And once again, just to touch on a point I made earlier, this technology is critical for the recipient to be able to launch modern airstrikes, right? So without these, the drones that Turkey was using in Libya, in Nagorno-Karabakh, in Syria, in Iraq, they would be incapable of launching modern airstrikes as we know them. So not only are these exported as weapons, but they should be seen as proper weapons due to the capabilities that they bring to the table.
And of course, they also have the ability to hover or stay on point and identify targets for ground forces or other artillery forces as well. So they can be implicated in other violations, even if they're not directly engaged in attacks that themselves violate international human rights obligations. I think that's another factor about drones that's been brought to our attention. On this issue, I think that satisfies me on that. But I am concerned about the idea of the requirement of states to reassess an existing permit when new information becomes available, because in October 2019, when Canada suspended the arms exports permits to Turkey, that just the granting of new ones, as you pointed out, but not interfering with existing permits. We are told that there were already 15 permits in existence covering as many as 60 cameras, including replacements of them if they happen to be damaged, and that wasn't interfered with at all. And it appears that these cameras were still being exported even after the April of 2020 further suspension of arms exports to Turkey under the previously granted permits. That would, can I ask you whether that itself would be a violation of the Arms Trade Treaty per se, as opposed to Canadian law in particular? Mr. Well, I would direct that at the witness from, well, anybody can answer that actually who wishes to do that.
If I could jump in first.
Yes, okay, Ms. Mason.
It is a standard. I mean, the most basic part of an export permit is an authorization to specific users for specific purposes. So if either of those conditions are breached by diversion to an unauthorized user or an unauthorized use, then that is the breach of the terms of the export permit. And therefore the government has the authority, has the full authority and actually the obligation under the ATT and Canadian legislation to stop further exports.
Even under existing permits?
Even under existing permits. And in fact, this business of keeping existing permits going is very unusual. All of the other countries, and most of them with respect to Saudi Arabia, most of our allies actually have suspended exports. They've actually suspended the exports. Belgium, for example, doesn't export the turrets that go on the armored vehicles, Canada's armored vehicles, the LAVs, doesn't export them to Canada because Canada will export them on to Saudi Arabia. It's a blanket prohibition on Belgium exporting those turrets to Canada so long as the situation is what it is in Yemen and Saudi Arabia. So this business of Canada only saying it has a moratorium, but it really doesn't because it's only new future permits, is really very, very troubling. And it's not the standard practice of others.
Ms. Mason, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much, Mr. Harris. We will now go into our second round, and the opening series of that round for 5 minutes goes to Mr. Morantz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you all for being here today. In my short time in Parliament, I was elected in October of 2019 and attending these committees. I don't think I've heard a more damning round of testimony from witnesses regarding the behavior of our government. A government that prides itself on its transparency in all aspects of its conduct. It strikes me that this is really the root of the problem here because we don't know why the export permits for the latest round of the Westcam drones to Turkey was approved. We do know that there's a conversation with the Prime Minister and President Erdogan in late April, and after that, permits were approved. But what I'm struggling to understand is we know that there was an issue with diversion already. These Canadian drones wound up in Libya. Over a year before, Canadian drones that were sold to Turkey also wound up in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. If risk assessments are to be taken seriously, how is it possible that the federal government would approve the sale of these drones to Turkey again, knowing that Turkey had already, as a NATO ally, violated the terms of the agreement by diverting technology to Libya? Maybe Project Plowshares could have at that one first.
Absolutely. We don't know the details of the risk assessment, but I would, and thank you for your question, Mr. Morantz, but I would emphasize that we do know without a doubt that they have been diverted. I want to emphasize this point, that this is not a matter of opinion or speculation or interpretation or trying to stretch the perceived evidence. This is a watertight case. They have been diverted, period, full stop. In fact, we're surprised that the investigation is taking so long and they haven't come back with a decision on what's going to happen. But you're right. This should have been caught at the risk assessment stage because there was a precedent, and these exports that have now been found in Nagorno-Karabakh should never have happened. So we have the only conclusion we can arrive at we've been following the Canadian arms exports for more than 30 years. We have attended every conference of the Arms Trade Treaty, is that we have a very flawed risk assessment process. And anyone who doubts that notion that we have a flawed risk assessment process should ask him or herself, how can you be selling arms to Saudi Arabia, one of the worst violators of human rights on the planet? How come you selling arms to Turkey, which is a known to be diverting these weapons, and not have a flawed risk assessment process? Because these instances set the bar impossibly low.
Yeah, and it's clear that I mean it was, the writing was on the wall after the diversion to Libya, so it's just very curious. And maybe we'll get the minister back at some point to ask him how that happened. It's a real curiosity. Just out of curiosity, with this whole issue of diversion, Turkey's a NATO ally. I suspect they're not happy with us that we stopped issuing export permits at this point. But like, how widespread is the problem of diversion? How do other countries deal with it? Is Turkey the only country that we know is doing it, or are there other NATO countries that are buying arms and selling them into other conflict areas?
If I can jump in, yes, diversion isn't necessarily super uncommon. And it has negative impacts. The proliferation of weapons obviously has negative impacts and is a fuel to conflict. However, other countries, allies of Canada, have gone above and beyond to try and stem the threat of diversion, and we've seen some positive examples how to do this. Other states parties to the ATT. So an example we could look at is with a regime of post-shipment verification. So for instance, Germany and Switzerland have an instrument where kind of baked into their authorization when they're authorizing export permits, there's a clause essentially where if risk is interpreted, then officials from the company or from the country exporting the weapons can go to the recipient and essentially check in and do an on-site investigation to make sure that everything is sound. That is one step immediately that Canada could take to kind of bridge this knowledge gap, because as my colleague Cesar was mentioning, this was an abject failure in Canada's risk assessment. And if civil society can dig up examples of diversion occurring from Waterloo, Ontario, then certainly global affairs with umpteenth times our resources could also do so.
Thank you. Okay, those are my questions, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Morantz. Next round goes to Mr. Fonseca for 5 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us. So under my understanding is that under the ATT, the minister must review the individual permit and the intended end use and end user. If there's evidence of the stated answers to things not being the case, such as diversion, the minister then has grounds to suspend. And that's exactly what happened in Nagorno-Karabakh. So I'm going to ask Mr. Jaramillo to be able to say different, or that's what happened in Nagorno-Karabakh.
Yes, Mr. Fonseca, thank you. That's a good point. As I said in my opening remarks, we have been here before, where the government, faced with increased media scrutiny, announces a suspension, because I will remind the members of this committee that this was not an instance of the government being proactive in identifying this diversion in Nagorno-Karabakh. This is as a result of civil society and media pushing and making these allegations come to light. So we didn't see any proactivity there. In reaction to the media scrutiny, the government has four times in the past 3 years announced similar suspensions. And 3 out of the 4, the fourth is still pending, 3 out of the 4 have reverted to the permits being reinstated. Every time the suspension coincides with heightened media scrutiny, and when the media attention dies down, the government again reinstates the permits. And this is a matter of fact. The past 3 instances, they have reinstated permits to Saudi Arabia and to Turkey after the first announcement that we would not sell them anymore. So we're at the 4th instance, so we have to take this suspension with a grain of salt. And this is not a matter of bad faith. It's simply of looking back at the recent precedent. Every suspension is eventually reinstated. We hope this one sticks, but again, 2 lessons here. One, that the government was not being proactive. It was faced with this evidence that was put before it. And secondly, that every similar occasion in recent years has not held. It has resulted in going back to the exports being reinstated. So we hope that this is not the case with the latest announced suspension.
Well, Mr. Jaramillo, and I hear you, but the minister suspended them on October 5th, and the Globe article came out on October 30th.
I don't have my dates in front of me.
That's the dates I have, that the minister suspended on October 5th. The Globe article, the media, as you're saying, came out on October 30th.
Right. Well, I can't comment educatedly on that because I don't have my timeline in front of me. There have been several media reports, and there has been reports by civil society related to arms exports.
I'm just trying to clarify the timeline. That was the timeline. Also, Mr. Jaramillo, I want to thank you. Earlier in in some of your remarks to some other of the questioners, you mentioned that we're in a better position today. Can you expand on that we are in a better position today?
Yes, one of the great benefits of the legislative process called Bill C-47, leading to the Canada's welcome accession to the Arms Trade Treaty, was the substantial risk clause. 2 words, shall not. As a result of this inclusion of the substantial risk clause, now it's not optional. It used to be that the government had an obligation to consider certain factors, but as long as the factors were considered, the minister, he or she, could basically authorize exports anywhere. Now the minister has a legal obligation. If a human rights trigger is identified, then the minister shall not authorize those shipments. So we are in a stronger position now because the minister, again, has the obligation to deny certain export permits. Now, the extent to which this is or will continue to be implemented remains to be seen.
Thank you, Ms. Mason. So the United States under President Donald Trump, they decided to withdraw from the ATT, and it was never ratified through the Senate. So what are the prospects for greater universalization of the ATT in the near term and in the long terms?
Well, of course, it'll be interesting to see what happens with the incoming administration, although it is the Senate that would have to approve, and so that that might be difficult. But it's important. I mean, I think we should bear in mind that there was on at least 3 occasions, Congress, on a bipartisan basis, voted to stop American arms exports to Saudi Arabia, and it was only President Trump's veto that stopped that. So United States, with respect to, Congress, with respect to arms exports to Saudi Arabia, wanted to stop them. So, I don't, there may not be a likelihood of United States signing up, ratifying the treaty. It's unlikely to get through the Senate, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of pressure in Congress to act in accordance with international legal obligations.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fonseca. Monsieur Bergeron, vous êtes le prochain avec l'allocation de 2 minutes et demie.
Mr. Bergeron, you have 2.5 minutes. I'll try to do this quickly. On the issue of drones, the cameras for the Turkish drones, I think the damage has been done. Insofar as some of us heard straight from the mouth of the Turkish ambassador to Canada that Turkey had developed a typically Turkish technology for the manufacturing of these drones, and so that they will now be able to do without the Canadian technology that they probably copied, in fact. But I want to come back to a statement that Ms. Mason made in her presentation to the Senate committee on C-47, where she emphasized the necessity to be very careful about commercial confidentiality. So when we're talking about, we had a hearing with officials from Global Affairs Canada. Several of the questions that we were asking were answered by saying we can't answer because of these issues of commercial confidentiality. So in your opinion, Ms. Mason, how do we get around that problem that parliamentarians, amongst others, are always faced with this kind of statement from Global Affairs Canada?
Thank you very much for that question. Because this is another area, I regret to say, of abuse by Global Affairs, abuse of the term commercial confidentiality. The OECD actually has a definition of commercial confidentiality, and it really is very narrowly construed to relate to factors to do with pricing and competitiveness of bids. And therefore, that should certainly not prevent the lion's share of the information being given to parliamentarians and to the public, for that matter.
Yes.
And that was used, of course, with Saudi Arabia. We weren't allowed to know anything. Well, it wasn't just that it was commercial confidentiality. Allegedly, it was a term of the agreement. One thing I do want to note right now, though, that doesn't get enough attention, and that is that in that report lifting the suspension the export suspension, the latest report, the April 2020 report on Saudi Arabia, the minister had one good thing to say, and that was that the renegotiated contract with Saudi Arabia removed the penalty. So there is the word is eliminated the penalty if the export breaches the authorized use of the authorized end user. So, and it also said that much more information could be given about the contract. So all in all, you should be able to get a lot more information.
Okay, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bergeron. And my
for 2.5 minutes.
Once again, I didn't hear you, Mr. Chair, but I'm assuming you said I had 2.5 minutes to ask some questions, so I'll proceed to do so. This seems to be a regular phenomenon when it switches from French to English. First of all, I think you've all said that you don't have a lot of faith in the assessment process carried out by Global Affairs Canada, and also the lack of transparency about who's doing it. We don't even know how much resources are given to this task, it seems. And the solution proposed by Ms. Mason and the Rideau Institute is that there ought to be an independent agency to do these assessments. Is that something that we would be following in someone else's, some other country's footsteps in doing, Ms. Mason, or would that be some place where we would be breaking new ground, as we have done, of course, in other areas of international arms issues, such as the landmines issue and others? But could you answer that question?
I haven't done an exhaustive review, but certainly I think it's fair to say that among Western countries, this would be groundbreaking. This would be something where Canada would be leading the way and demonstrating that we don't just say we believe in a rules-based international order, but we actually implement. You know, we put our money where our mouth is. And but so far as I know, it would be groundbreaking. But I want to emphasize that I did mention at the very end an interim step, which the government can do immediately. And if they say they're complying with international law and Canadian law, they should have no problem with this. And that is add to the existing process the requirement for an independent expert legal opinion. And the question is, will this proposed export be in compliance with Canada's legal obligations under the ATT? And so that's something we could do immediately, and that would kind of be a start of getting the idea that this has to be based on evidence and on expert legal opinion.
And if I may, also in the interim, I agree with Ms. Mason, also in the interim, as I said earlier, our recommendation is that this very committee could establish a subcommittee to be apprised of these matters, because the risk assessment process is indeed flawed. It is reactive. And Mr. Fonseca, I mean, from September 22nd, the CBC, Canada accused of breaching obligations under the Arms Treaty before the decision was made. So already in September, this was in the media, which points to that flawed risk assessment.
I think my time is up, and we would love to have another hour with you. Maybe we'll have to get you all back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harris. Chers collègues, cela nous amène à la fin de notre session.
Colleagues, that brings us to the end of our session and almost to the end of the parliamentary year.
For sharing their expertise and their insights with us this afternoon. J'aimerais également remercier notre merveilleuse.
I'd also like to thank our wonderful House of Commons team, our analysts, our interpreters, our technicians and messengers.
Committee and to our teams, thank you for your service and for your collaboration. I would like to wish you and your loved ones and all Canadians the very best for the holiday season. A happy Hanukkah, a Merry Christmas, a happy Kwanzaa, and very importantly, a healthy, happy, and successful New Year. Joyeuses fêtes à vous, à vos proches.
Happy holidays to all of you and to your loved ones and to all Canadians. Happy Hanukkah, Merry Christmas, and Thank
you so much.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you.
Merry Christmas, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
New Year.
Thank you very much.
Happy
See
New
you
Year.
again next year.
Merry Christmas. Feliz Natal.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Happy holidays.
Bon fête.
And happy Festivus.
That also,
It's a
yes.
holiday for all of us.
Bon
Happy
fête.
Festivus.
Well said,
Absolutely.
Hetty. Well said.